In this episode of the Civil Engineering Podcast, it's going to be another one of our Women in Civil Engineering episodes, and we're going to speak with Philippa Jefferis. Philippa is a British civil engineer who took a risk, and she went to work in a project in a faraway land up in the mountains, tough terrain, but she wanted to help to bring two communities together for the first time. And in fact, she helped an 80-year-old man to see a car for the first time in his life. And really what she's talking about in this episode is the true impact that civil engineers can have. So with that, let's jump into this episode. All right, now I'm excited to welcome our guest for today, Philippa Jefferis. Philippa is a civil engineer specializing in transportation or highway projects. She's working internationally, which is exciting because we haven't had many guests on the podcast talking about international work. So Philippa, welcome to the Civil Engineering Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here and to connect across continents as well.
Yeah, for sure. Excited to have you. I'm excited because this is another episode of our Women in Civil Engineering series, and also one that we have someone from outside the U.S., which is exciting to me. So before we do anything else, Philippa, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell them a little bit about your background and your career journey?
Sure. So as you said, I'm a civil engineer and I specialize in highways. I'm British and trained in the UK, worked there for a number of years, and then had a slight career dilemma. I kind of saw my entire future ahead of me, and it wasn't all that exciting. As much as there was job security in the industry, there wasn't kind of anything to get me out of bed on a Monday morning. And through a friend of a friend, I started discussing what did I want to do, and he suggested the company that I now work for. And I sort of went for an interview, and that's how I ended up working in the international sector, because I wanted to get back to the true side of engineering. So now my engineering, I have to admit, has really come back to what I consider the critical elements of civil engineering. That brings us back to right back to where we all started, but we perhaps have forgotten in, say, America and the UK, is that engineering can change lives, and it can be right at your doorstep, changing your life.
That's really interesting. So you felt like you needed something to get you more excited about what you did.
Yeah, and I mean, the work that I was doing was interesting. I was working in cycleways and designing, at the forefront of doing sustainability, and it's something that's really critical in the UK market. But I just felt like the direction that my career was going, and perhaps the industry, there wasn't that level of interest and investment from maybe the governments that were funding the work that I was doing. I had an uphill battle, no pun intended. I can do cycleways that go uphill, but I just wanted to, I felt like there wasn't their engagement, and I'm really passionate about what we can achieve, and yet my clients there weren't so engaged. Whereas I now work on a different side of it, where there is definitely much more engagement in the industry.
That's interesting. And right now you're working in Nepal on a project that we're going to get into in a minute, but is it the international and the travel and that aspect of it that you also like as well in what you do now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant opportunity for me to explore and get to see the world, and actually be part of a community. I love going on holiday and exploring new cultures and meeting new people, but I am fully embedded and living in a country different from my own, and that brings with it its own challenges and expectations. So I'm working with different colleagues, and I'm learning loads of things from them, because they just come at it with a completely different perspective to them what I used to do.
That's great. So tell us about the project you're working on now.
Sure. So I'm working on it's part of a rural access program. It's funded by the British government. And my company has the contract to build, we've built a number of roads, but primarily we're focusing on one road called the Mugu-Humla Link-Road. It's a 67-kilometer road, and basically it's in the furthest northwest part of Nepal. For those who maybe are scratching to find a map and work out where Nepal is, it's north of India and south of China. So strategically, it's in between some really quite big powerhouses in terms of a country. But historically, it's held its own. But it's in the Himalayas. My construction site starts at a point above sea level that is higher than any point that is in the UK. So I'm already, based in Kathmandu, the capital city of Nepal, is 1,400 meters above sea level, but my construction site is 2,000 meters above sea level and goes up to over 4,000 meters. So it's some really challenging terrain. And the people there are primarily farmers, and the kind of the two regions that we're linking, one of them has never had any road access to the rest of the country. So I was in the vehicle, the first ever car to be driven from the rest of Nepal into Mugu. So it's this first time of driving in. So it's when I talk about being like at the forefront and really on people's doorsteps, like there was a gentleman there, he was in his 80s, he'd never seen a car before, and there we are turning up with a car. So it's completely different to anything that I did in the UK, and that's why I kind of get really passionate about it, because it's back to what engineering was always about, of really kind of changing people's lives.
Yeah, no, that's great. When you say, impacting communities, I mean, certainly when someone's seeing a car for the first time when they're 80, I think I'm sure you feel great about that in terms of being on that project site and being a part of that. You talked about the terrain. We were supposed to do this interview a couple of weeks back, and I know that there was some rain and there was some really disastrous roadway conditions. Talk to us about the terrain and how that's been challenging for the project in general.
Sure. So yeah, I'm very grateful that we could reschedule, because sometimes it's a lesson I've learned in this job is things don't always go to plan. And basically my flight was due to fly back. The regional airport that we fly in a 15-seater airplane. It's proper tiny. And when you first see the runway, you think, is that it? Where's the rest of the runway? But it's the only part of that area that's actually got any blacktop. It's been tarmac. So as a civil engineer, you kind of come in and go, well, that's a nice runway, but that's the last time you see tarmac for the rest of the week, kind of thing. And we're talking hilly and steep terrain, but also 3 months of the year, it's raining from the monsoon, and 3 months of the year, part of our project site is buried under snow. So we're not dealing with proper, decent sealed roads here. This is earthen roads. So, I mean, it's mud. It's compacted mud. And then you've got the challenge of water flooding down that and just ruining all your hard work. So yeah, there's lots. Yeah, the environment is perhaps against us a lot of the time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I'm sure there are many civil engineers listening to this episode saying, they were upset about not being able to access the site for 24 hours because of rain or something. And now they're feeling probably pretty good about their geographical limits. But nonetheless, let's talk about that in general, because also, like, I think in terms of like scheduling, talk about how that could impact scheduling.
Yeah, so it's funny because I compare it to like my life in the UK and friends of mine who are working there. So in London, it's such a congested place that we've developed this just-in-time construction. So you have everything arrive at the moment that you're going to use it. You haven't got the space to store anything. In the complete reverse of that, because we don't have road access to our site for quite a lot of the year, and we have the majority of the work is done by labor, but we have 11 excavators working, and we needed to keep the fuel supplies there for them. So we ended up storing 90,000 liters of fuel over the monsoon period. So This is definitely not just in time delivery. This is, oh my goodness, I have a highly dangerous substance. Where am I going to store it? How am I going to make sure that I've got enough? And also, how am I getting it there? Because the river level is too high now, so we can't drive across the river anymore. The bridge isn't there yet. So there's a ropeway system owned by a private guy that owns it, and he ships the barrels across for us. So yeah, there's been some intense times where you go, I've got to really think this through and really know what I'm trying to do in the next few months so that I'm prepared and ready, because there's not a kind of supplier at the other end of the phone that I go, could you just bring in an extra couple of liters of fuel? That's not an option.
That's not an option. So Philippa, what is your specific role on the project?
So I am the safeguard and compliance manager, which means that I work with a number of Nepalese engineers, but because I come from a British background, I bring in more of a focus on the safety and the constructability elements, and making sure that we are compliant to the design standards that are in place in Nepal, but also I'm compliant to the criteria that is set by the UK government who fund the project, because the whole idea is that we're actually building capacity here and education as well. So I need to be making sure that we do it in best practice, and it's an education as much as a project to just build the road.
That's great. Now, can you talk about Nepal a little bit as a people, the community there, the people there? You're entrenched there, you're living there, you're working there. And so how, this is new for a lot of them. How are they handling this? How are they impacting you in terms of living there and your relationship with them? Talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit it's a wonderfully welcoming place, and I encourage anyone to come and visit. Actually, I'll be in trouble if I don't mention it's Nepal 2020 Visit Nepal next year, so definitely a time to come visit. But the people here, there is a kind of a culture, and the best way I can describe it is actually using the Nepali phrase, which is "Ke gane," or "What can you do?" And I come from a very British regimented approach where I have a lot of things I can do and I've planned it out. And that was my training in my engineering training. I've come here and I work with some fantastic engineers, but they have a very different approach as to how things are going to work out. And if something goes wrong, it's, well, it was going to happen. Like, why are you getting stressed by it? And I guess there's a compromise to be had, because sometimes actually if you let things roll out a bit more, you go, oh, okay, now I see where this is going. And they know their environment better than I do. I can't come in and dictate. But at the same time, it's like there is a much more relaxed approach to say, oh, well, it's not quite to the design standards. Like, why do we need to have a radius of 12 meters for this hairpin bend? And I'm going, well, because that's one, the design standards, but also because we want to build something that lasts. It may work for now with the mule train, so like the donkeys that transport a lot of the goods, sure, they can get around that radius of the bend, but if we want to bring buses in and they've got to go around these roads, that's why we need to bring in those standards. So my biggest challenge is sometimes going, am I being too uptight about this? Or because actually it is a challenging environment and we won't achieve perfection. But at the same time, maybe my colleagues can join me a little bit on that. No, okay, we don't have to just say "Ke gane." We actually have got something that we can do.
Interesting. And do you rely on local engineers or professionals from the region there to help you with some of the terrain or other issues that you might just need information about?
Yeah, and we have the design was carried out by local Nepalese engineers, and they are still working with us during construction. And they're the ones who best know the situation, but also how to manage the labor force and the kind of the culture there. I can make assumptions and I can start to get a feel, but when certain things happen, when there's people who get sort of disenfranchised with the work, they have a much better understanding of why that might be the case. And we're actually also then working with the professional engineering institution here in Nepal to help them provide the PEng registration for Nepalese engineers. And some of our engineers are going to be the first to kind of go through that process, because we want them to be recognized for the great skills and knowledge that they actually have.
Wow, so you really are doing a lot of kind of first things over there in Nepal, which is very, very exciting. Talk a little bit about, you're obviously a woman in the field of civil engineering, which is what this series is about. And, you're obviously have taken some big risks in your career in terms of a lot of traveling, putting yourself really out of your comfort zone in a whole nother country. Talk about how, handling that as a woman has been for you in a field that there are a lot more men than women, even though we're making progress on that. What are
Yeah,
your thoughts on that in general?
we're absolutely making progress, and I'm optimistic, that we can make a change. When my dad was studying engineering, there was one woman on his course. When I was studying, there were 10. So, progress is being made. But I think actually there are challenges faced, and even more so maybe in the international field, because there are certain progress sort of steps that we've made in the UK and sort of in the Western world where you almost take for granted that people understand that there are gender challenges and that we need to promote it. Here, it's when you have that conversation, it's understood, but perhaps the way I interact with some of my colleagues, they might be it is still new to them for me to turn up, one, because I'm a Westerner turning up in their country telling them, oh, well, you should do it this way, but two, because I am female. And it's a challenge because you're very conscious of who you are the whole time, and you want to make sure that you're not offending or you're actually bringing someone on board, but at the same time, you still have a job to deliver. So I find that the best thing is I take a lot more time to step back and listen and hear my colleagues out. And I can't be as pushy as I would be, say, in the UK, because they're not ready for that pushiness. And it's been a lesson in kind of nudging and nudge tactics. And, you know, I come in all fiery, like, women independence, I can do this just as much as anyone else. And then you have to go, well, hang on, how does that come across and how is that perceived? Because that's actually very, very different culturally to what would have normally happened here. So it comes with its challenges. But I also think that I then can bring a different perspective that has definitely not necessarily been seen here as much. So our labour force, we have a target that 33% of our labour force should be women. So there's an understanding here, and that, I mean, that's set by the British government as a target, but it's also understood as with our labour. But actually considering menstrual health, which I never thought I'd have to consider as an engineer, apart from possibly my own, but my labour force, we've actually provided workshops to help the women make their own reusable sanitary pads. And for me, that's something that makes me realize how much engineering and like the way that we interact with our workforce, we need to think wider about if we're going to diversify this workforce, you've got to go into people's personal lives and consider their health and things that you wouldn't have otherwise considered because you're engineers, you're just doing the design, right, or just doing construction. Well, no, actually these women, to give us a bit more background, in Nepal, there's a practice, a chowdhury practice, where women, when they were menstruating, would be expected to go into the cowshed and not interact with society for a week. And that practice has been kind of broken down, but there's still that taboo. And we've been trying to help our laborers go, hey, here's a tool and support to say, no, you can also still come to work. You can still engage. And those are the sort of things that you need. I don't think any of my male engineers colleagues would have been so comfortable about discussing. They are very comfortable about it now, and it's nice to have that kind of openness, and we talk about it in meetings, and they were part of the workshops and they've been there. But that's something that wouldn't have been there 5-10 years ago. I mean, 2 years ago we didn't have that, and it's those sort of things that I think we can bring in, that slightly different perspective shift.
Wow, that's awesome. And really, Philippa, you're doing a lot of awesome things in terms of new things or breaking down barriers and, creating new opportunities for communities, for individuals, which sounds like the reason you wanted to take on this job, when you started it. So it's certainly a great thing to hear that. So just last question before we jump into our hot seat segment, I want to ask you about, what would you say to civil engineers that are in their jobs and they're considering pursuing international work, kind of pushing themselves a little bit and getting out of their day-to-day where they live, but maybe taking a risk like you took? What would your message be to them?
I think I've got no regrets, but at the same time, it is a big challenge, and be prepared to be challenged in ways that you never thought you'd be challenged. That's not to say don't do it, but also while I was at university, I studied with Engineers Without Borders, with a charity that was part of my student movement. So I'd had some engagement with international development and an understanding of the sort of the context and the knowledge that you need to have while working in development. It's having appropriate technology. I'm not doing anything fancy or shiny. I'm not going to build the world's tallest building or anything, but it's that appropriateness of the technology. And so maybe start looking into some TED Talks. Hans Rosling does some amazing talks on sort of development. But also there are organizations, I know in the UK, it's called REDAR UK. So they're the kind of disaster relief engineers that go in, and you can sign up and be on their register, and if a natural disaster happens, you can go out and support with your engineering skills. And that's a great sort of way of getting into that industry and starting to get a feel for it, because a lot of it does come down to mistakes have been made before in development through engineering, and we need to make sure that we are training ourselves, and our own personal career development is looking at going, why are we going overseas? What are our reasons? And making sure it's for the right reasons for the people that we're then fundamentally helping at the end of the day. So have a look at some courses, go and do some training, and get a bit of an exposure, because you think you're going to be in for a culture shock, and it's you can never be ready for the level of culture shock you might face.
All right, awesome. All right, so we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back in a minute. We're going to put Philippa on the civil engineering hot seat, so stick with us. I hope you are enjoying this episode of the Civil Engineering Podcast, which is produced by the Engineering Management Institute. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel here for more podcast episodes and for all of our Engineering Manager 80/20 Shorts videos that we publish weekly, where we interview successful engineering managers. Now it's time to jump into our Civil Engineering Hot Seat segment. All right, we're back with Philippa Jefferis. Philippa is a British civil engineer now working on a very interesting project in Nepal that we talked about a bit. But now, Philippa, we're going to focus on your career. Are you ready for some hot seat questions?
Absolutely, bring it on.
You can handle it. You've already gone overseas to work on some project in the mountains, so you can handle these. All right, first question. Are there any specific rituals that you practice every day? For example, do you have a specific morning routine or lunchtime routine or something that you do consistently on a daily basis that has contributed to your success as a professional?
Oh, I'd love to have a morning routine, but I'm not a morning person. But the one thing I try to do before I go to bed, I have a diary that it's a 5-year diary. So you write all of 3 sentences for each day. And it helps me kind of process what I did today, so that I don't then lie there in bed processing it and not getting to sleep. But also it's really interesting to then see back, like last year, I'm into the 3rd year now, and go, oh, like last year I was really stressed and worried about this. And now I take that in my stride. It's really lovely to just have that momentary reflection and be like, oh, and some days it's very boring and I didn't do anything, but other days you go, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh, that's so easy now. And it's really nice to have that reminder of how far you've progressed.
Wow, that's very interesting. All right, next one. What is one book that you might recommend to engineers, or just one book in general that you found to be extremely helpful in your professional or even personal development efforts?
Oh, that's a challenging one, because there are lots of good books out there, and I kind of flick through. I've just finished reading Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong. So maybe not so much for the engineering aspect, but it was a really interesting read. Basically, how our preconceived notions can change our biases. So maybe not so much as engineers, but the scientists that are in all engineers need to be a bit wary of what are our preconceived notions that might actually skew our results in the end. So I think Inferior is definitely worth a read.
Interesting. All right. Next question. You've undoubtedly had different managers or supervisors throughout your career that you've worked for. If you were to look back, and I'm not asking you to name any names, but just thinking about them, if you were to think of your favorite manager, or one of your favorite managers, what made them your favorite? What kind of characteristics or things that they did?
I think my favorite manager, one used to send us a quote every Friday, a sort of an inspirational quote, but a little bit of it, not just live, love, laugh or whatever, but actually something a bit more gritty as an inspirational quote. But it was that someone who then challenged me to think a bit differently and keep progressing. I like the fact that in one of your other podcasts, you're talking about how you feel it's a duty of civil engineers to continue to grow. And that's what I completely agree with. And having a manager who believes that as well. And then also, almost as I describe it as the sand in an oyster that creates the pearl. It's going to be really irritating to that oyster, and they must almost drives them insane, but at the end of it you get a pearl. So there's going to be someone, your manager might not be your best friend. They might drive you and irritate you because they remind you haven't done what you should be doing. But if it's in the path that you better yourself, then that's the best kind of manager.
That's awesome. All right, I got one last question for you, Philippa. We call it the civil engineering career elevator advice question. So if you were to get into an elevator with a civil engineer for 30 seconds, 40 seconds, and you had to give him or her some kind of career advice, what would it be in that short period of time?
I think find someone like a mentor or a coach who can support you. They don't have to be an engineer either. If anything, probably better not to be an engineer, but find someone who's in your corner. And that I think engineers, we're supposed to be team players, but a lot of the time it then does come down to just the one individual, and that can be quite lonely. So if you can find someone that's in your corner that you can bounce ideas off of, who you don't need to articulate yourself in any particular way, but they understand you when you go, oh, I've had one of those, and they know what's happened, that can bring so much clarity and help you through your day. So find someone that can understand your grunts and mumbles.
That's great. So how long is this project in Nepal anticipated to last for?
So construction should be, if all goes to plan, finished in June next year, and then it will be a case of handover. And we've also got a maintenance component. So coming behind this, just because we built it doesn't mean it will last. So then it'll be starting to look at how do we help government maintain this, because it's their asset to maintain. So from June, the road will be built, and hopefully we can drive the full length. So reducing a 3.5-day walk down to probably about a 4 to 5 hour drive. Wow. And then it'll be on with the maintenance, which is the less sexy bit of engineering, but just as important.
Right. And so is your plan right now to stay there till it's constructed? Is that the plan?
Yeah, I really want to see this through to the end. It's like, it would be so satisfying to sort of see the changes that we've made. So I will definitely be here till June, or at least till it's constructed. And then after that, there's plenty of other places in the world that need engineers. So who knows where I'll next be.
Well, Philippa, thank you so much for spending some time with us on the Civil Engineering Podcast. I think you really kind of have reminded us that, civil engineering is really about making positive change to the world, like big time changes to the world. And you just said it yourself there about how you're, able to help people now no longer have to take a 3.5 day walk. It'll be more of a 4 to 5 hour drive when this project is finished. And those are, I think, things that a lot of civil engineers, what got them into civil engineering, right? The ideas around projects like that. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your evening now, because you had a long day of work already. Appreciate it so much. And not only for coming on the podcast, but for speaking about, being a woman as a civil engineer as part of this series, which we're trying to really highlight women in civil engineering. I'm so glad that we found you. So thank you for doing this.
No, well, thank you for doing this, because I've been enjoying listening to your podcast and the episodes that I'm hearing. So it's great to hear and be able to engage with other engineers across the world. The technology's there, so let's build this network. That's
right. And we'll be sure to check in with you going forward, and maybe once the project's done, we can do another follow-up episode.
Absolutely. And if you fancy flying out, I'll happily drive you down the length of the road.
Awesome. All right, Philippa, thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Civil Engineering Podcast on YouTube, produced by the Engineering Management Institute. We're always looking for new ways to help engineers become effective managers and leaders. You can view all of our content on our website at engineeringmanagementinstitute.org, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel here for our weekly videos. Until next time, please continue to engineer your own success.